Let me tell you about Margaret. 68 years old, widow, 2 kids. She had $400,000 in the bank. In 18 months, it was gone. And here's the thing. She didn't spend it on luxury. She didn't gamble it away. She didn't fall for a scam. She just didn't know what to do. And that not knowing cost her everything. This is Margaret's story, but it could be anyone's story, because what happened to her happens quietly, every day, to people who thought they did everything right. Margaret's husband died in March. Heart attack. Sudden. They'd been married 44 years. He handled the money. All of it. The bills, the investments, the accounts, the insurance. Margaret knew they had money. She knew they were comfortable, but she didn't know the details. She never needed to. Tom took care of it. And then Tom was gone, and Margaret was sitting in a lawyer's office 3 weeks after the funeral, being handed folders full of papers she didn't understand. Account statements, policy documents, investment portfolios. And everyone kept asking her what she wanted to do. What did she want to do with the 401k? What did she want to do with the life insurance payout? Did she want to roll it over or take a distribution? Did she understand the tax implications? And Margaret just nodded, because she didn't want to seem stupid. She didn't want to admit that she had no idea what any of it meant. So she said yes to things. She signed things. And she walked out of that office with $400,000 deposited into a checking account, thinking that at least now she had control of it. At least now she could figure it out. But she didn't figure it out, because nobody taught her how. Her kids lived out of state. They called every week, asked if she was okay, if she needed anything, and she said no. She said she was fine, because she didn't want to worry them. She didn't want to be a burden. So she handled it herself, except she didn't know what handling it meant. The money sat in the checking account, earning nothing, losing value every month to inflation. But Margaret didn't know that. She just knew the balance was there, $400,000. It felt like a lot. It felt like enough to last. So she started spending from it, not recklessly, just normally. She paid the mortgage, she paid the property taxes, she covered the utilities and the car insurance and groceries. She helped her daughter with some dental work her insurance didn't cover. She replaced the water heater when it broke. She paid for Tom's headstone. Normal things, necessary things. And every month the balance went down. Not by much, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, but it went down. And Margaret didn't think much of it, because $400,000 is a big number. Watching it go from $400,000 to $385,000 didn't feel dangerous. It felt manageable. But then her son called. He'd lost his job. He had 3 kids and a mortgage and no income. And he didn't ask Margaret for help directly. He just told her what was happening. And Margaret, because she loved him, because she didn't want her grandchildren to suffer, sent him $15,000 to cover the gap until he found something. And he did find something 3 months later, and he paid her back, most of it, $10,000. He said he'd get her the rest soon. And Margaret said, don't worry about it, because what's $5,000 when you have $400,000? Except by then, she didn't have $400,000 anymore. She had $340,000, and she still didn't see the danger, because the number was still big, still 6 figures, still more than she'd ever had in her checking account when Tom was alive. Then the roof started leaking. The roofer said it needed to be replaced, $18,000. Margaret didn't have $18,000 liquid without dipping into the account, so she dipped. And then the car needed major repairs, $3,200. And then her daughter's husband left her, and she needed help with the rent for a few months until the divorce settled, $6,000. And then Margaret's prescription costs went up because she switched to a Medicare plan that had a lower premium but higher out-of-pocket costs, and she didn't realize it until she was at the pharmacy, paying $900 for 3 months of medication that used to cost her $200. And every time something happened, Margaret pulled from the account, because that's what the money was there for, to handle things, to keep her life stable, to help her family. And it was working. Everything got handled. The roof got fixed. The car kept running. Her daughter stabilized.
Margaret's prescriptions got filled. Life continued. But the account kept shrinking. 14 months after Tom died, Margaret checked the balance and saw $220,000. And for the first time, she felt afraid, because she'd lost almost half of it. And she hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't bought anything extravagant. She hadn't traveled. She hadn't remodeled the kitchen or bought a new car or taken a cruise. She just lived. And somehow, living had cost $180,000 in 14 months. She sat at her kitchen table with a calculator
And a notebook and tried to figure out what happened. Tried to add up all the expenses, but she couldn't remember everything. There were so many small things: a $1,200 furnace repair, a $600 plumber visit, $400 for new glasses, $2,000 to help her son with his kids' school expenses, $800 for the vet when her dog got sick. Individually, none of it felt large, but together it was $180,000, and she didn't know how to make it stop. That's when Margaret made her first big mistake. She called a financial advisor, not because she found a good one, but because one had been calling her, leaving voicemails, sending letters, saying he specialized in helping widows, saying he could help her make her money work for her. And Margaret, desperate and scared and not knowing who else to ask, finally called him back. His name was Richard. He had a nice office. He wore a suit. He seemed trustworthy. He asked her about her goals, her situation, her concerns, and Margaret told him everything. Told him about Tom, about the $400,000, about how it was down to $220,000, and she didn't know why. And Richard nodded. He said he saw this all the time: widows who didn't have a plan, who let their money sit in checking accounts losing value, who spent emotionally instead of strategically. He said he could fix it. He said he could get her a better return. He said he could create a structure that would make the money last. And Margaret believed him, because she needed to believe someone. Richard moved her money. He put $150,000 into an annuity. He said it was safe, guaranteed, that she'd get monthly payments for the rest of her life. He put $50,000 into a managed portfolio, stocks, bonds, a mix. He said it would grow. He left $20,000 in checking for her to access, and he charged her $8,000 in fees to set it all up. Margaret didn't understand most of what he explained, but she signed the papers, because Richard seemed confident, because he said this was the right move, because she didn't know what else to do. 3 months later, Margaret needed $12,000 for a medical procedure her insurance only partially covered. She called Richard, asked if she could pull it from the annuity. He said yes, but there would be a surrender charge, 10%. She'd lose $1,200 just to access her own money. Margaret was stunned. She didn't remember him saying that. Maybe he had. Maybe she just didn't understand. She asked about the managed portfolio. Could she pull from that? Richard said yes, but the market was down. Right now, if she sold, she'd be locking in a loss. He recommended waiting. Margaret didn't have time to wait. She needed the procedure. So she took the surrender charge, paid the $1,200 penalty, got her $12,000, and felt sick about it. That's when Margaret started to unravel what had happened. She pulled out all the paperwork Richard had given her, started reading it carefully, started looking up terms she didn't understand, and she realized the annuity wasn't what she thought it was. The guaranteed monthly payments wouldn't start for another 8 years. Until then, her money was locked. And the fees Richard charged weren't just the $8,000 up front. There were ongoing fees, expense ratios, commissions embedded in the products he sold her. She was paying nearly 3% a year in total costs. On $200,000, that was $6,000 a year just in fees.
going to Richard and the companies whose products he sold. Margaret felt like an idiot. She felt betrayed. But more than anything, she felt trapped. Because she'd already signed everything, the money was already moved, and getting it out would cost her even more in penalties. By month 18, Margaret had $125,000 left. The annuity was untouchable without massive penalties. The managed portfolio had lost value because the market dipped and Richard's picks underperformed. And her checking account, which she was still pulling from for daily expenses, was nearly empty. She was 68 years old, living on Social Security, which was $1,800 a month. Her mortgage was $1,100. Her property taxes, insurance, utilities, and other fixed costs were another $900. That left her negative $200 a month before she even bought food or gas or anything else. She was going backwards. And the money that was supposed to carry her through the rest of her life was mostly gone. Not because she was irresponsible, but because she didn't know how to protect it, didn't know who to trust, didn't know that doing nothing was sometimes better than doing the wrong thing. Margaret's story doesn't have a happy ending, at least not yet. She had to sell her house, moved into a small apartment, lives very carefully now, watches every dollar. Her kids help when they can, but they have their own lives, their own expenses. Margaret isn't starving, she isn't homeless, but the retirement she thought she'd have, the security she thought Tom had built for them, is gone. And it didn't disappear because of one catastrophic event. It disappeared because she didn't know.
1,000 small decisions made from a position of not knowing, of trusting the wrong person, of being afraid to ask for help until it was too late. Now, let's talk about what actually happened to Margaret and why it happens to so many people just like her. The first problem was the life insurance payout. $400,000 deposited into a checking account. The lawyers should have told her not to do that, should have explained that a checking account earned essentially nothing and that inflation erodes the value of cash sitting still. But the lawyer's job was to transfer assets, not to give financial advice. So the money went into checking, and it sat there, losing approximately 3% of its value per year to inflation. Over 18 months, that's about $18,000 in purchasing power just gone. Not spent, just eroded. Margaret didn't see that loss because the number in the account didn't change from inflation, but the value did. What $400,000 could buy in March was not what it could buy 18 months later. That's the invisible loss, the one nobody explains to you. The second problem was the spending. Margaret wasn't reckless, but she also wasn't strategic. She helped family, she fixed things as they broke, she paid for medical needs. All reasonable, all understandable, but she never asked herself the critical question, can I afford this? Not in the moment, but in the context of the rest of her life. She had no idea how long $400,000 needed to last. She didn't know her life expectancy, didn't know her average annual expenses, didn't have a withdrawal plan. So every expense felt manageable in isolation, $5,000 here, $15,000 there. But those small amounts add up faster than you think when there's no new money coming in. Margaret was spending at a rate of roughly $10,000 per month when you average it out. That pace would drain $400,000 in just over 3 years. But she didn't do that math. She just spent as needs arose, and needs kept arising. The third problem was Richard, the financial advisor who positioned himself as a helper but functioned as a salesman. Richard wasn't a fiduciary, meaning he wasn't legally required to act in Margaret's best interest. He was required to sell her products that were suitable, but suitability is a much lower bar than best interest. The annuity he sold her paid him a commission, probably 6 to 8%. On $150,000, that's $9,000 to $12,000 that went into Richard's pocket the moment Margaret signed. The managed portfolio also generated fees, and none of
those products were designed for someone in Margaret's situation, someone who needed liquidity, who might need access to money for unexpected expenses, who couldn't afford to have funds locked up or exposed to market risks she didn't understand. But Richard didn't care about that. Or if he did, he cared more about his commission. And Margaret didn't know enough to ask the right questions, didn't know what a fiduciary was, didn't know how Richard was compensated, didn't know that the products he was recommending benefited him more than they benefited her. The fourth problem was isolation. Margaret didn't tell anyone what was happening until it was too late, didn't tell her kids she was scared, didn't ask friends if they knew a trustworthy advisor, didn't seek out free resources, community programs, non-profit financial counseling. She handled it alone because she didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to seem incapable. And that pride, that independence, cost her everything. Because if she'd asked for help earlier, someone might have caught the mistakes before they compounded. Someone might have told her not to leave $400,000 in checking, not to trust the first advisor who called her, not to pull money from the annuity with a 10% penalty. But she didn't ask, and by the time the damage was visible, it was done. Now here's the part that makes Margaret's story so tragic. None of this was inevitable. If Margaret had known just a few basic things, she could have made that $400,000 last the rest of her life. She could be living comfortably right now instead of struggling in a one-bedroom apartment, counting every dollar. Let's walk through what she should have done, what anyone in her situation should do. First, don't let a large sum sit in checking. The moment that life insurance payout hit her account, Margaret should have moved the majority of it into a high-yield savings account or money market fund, something that earns interest. Even a modest 4% return would have generated $16,000 a year. That's $1,300 a month, enough to nearly close the gap between her Social Security and her expenses, just by letting the money sit somewhere smarter. She didn't need to take risk, didn't need to invest in stocks, just needed to move it out of checking and into something that paid interest. That one move would have changed everything. Second, create a withdrawal plan. Before touching a single dollar, Margaret should have calculated her safe withdrawal rate. The rule is 4% per year. On $400,000, that's $16,000 annually, about $1,300 per month. Combined with her $1,800 Social Security, that gives her $3,100 per month. More than enough to cover her fixed expenses and live modestly. But the key is sticking to that rate, not spending $10,000 one month because things came up, not dipping in for family emergencies without accounting for it. The withdrawal plan is a budget. It's a guardrail. And Margaret didn't have one. She just spent as needed. And needs always expand to consume available resources if you let them. Third, work with the fiduciary. Not someone who calls you, not someone who sells products, a fee-only fiduciary financial planner who is legally obligated to act in your best interest. Margaret should have paid someone $1,500 to $3,000 for a one-time comprehensive plan. That planner would have looked at her situation, her income, her expenses, her goals, her health, and created a roadmap. They would have told her where to put the money, how much to keep liquid, how much to invest conservatively, what her safe spending rate was. They would have saved her from Richard, saved her from the annuity with surrender charges, saved her from paying 3% in annual fees. That $3,000 investment in good advice would have been the best money she ever spent. But she didn't know fee-only fiduciaries existed, didn't know the difference between someone who works for her and someone who works for commissions. So she ended up with Richard, and Richard cost her everything. Fourth, resist the urge to help family without planning for it.
Margaret's instinct to help her son was beautiful, but giving him $15,000 without thinking through the long-term impact was a mistake. Not because helping is wrong, but because unplanned generosity can jeopardize your own security, and then you become the one who needs help. A better approach would have been to sit down with a calculator and figure out how much she could afford to give without compromising her future. Maybe that number was $5,000. Maybe it was $10,000. Maybe it was zero and she needed to help in other ways. But making that decision based on emotion rather than math is how people run out of money. And once you're out, you can't help anyone, including yourself. Fifth, understand what you're signing. Margaret signed documents she didn't understand because she felt pressured, because she didn't want to look stupid, because Richard made it all sound so reasonable. But you should never, ever sign a financial document you don't fully understand. Never. If an advisor can't explain something in plain language, that's a red flag. If you feel rushed, that's a red flag. If there are fees or penalties buried in the fine print, that's a red flag. Margaret should have taken those documents home, read them carefully, looked up every term she didn't know, called her kids and asked them to review it, sought a second opinion from another advisor, anything except signing in that moment. Because once it's signed, it's done. And unwinding bad financial products is expensive, sometimes impossible. What happened to Margaret is not rare, it's common. Widows in particular are targeted because they often come into large sums suddenly through life insurance, because they're emotionally vulnerable, because many were not involved in managing household finances and don't know how to start. And predatory advisors know this. They know how to sound trustworthy. They know how to exploit fear and uncertainty. They know how to sell products that benefit them while appearing to help you. Margaret's story is the same story that plays out thousands of times a year across the country. Someone loses a spouse, inherits money, doesn't know what to do, trusts the wrong person, and watches their financial security disappear. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you're in Margaret's position, or if you know someone who is, here's what you need to know. First, take your time. You don't have to make any decisions immediately. The money can sit in a savings account for 6 months while you grieve, while you educate yourself, while you find the right help. There's no rush. Anyone who pressures you to move quickly is not working in your best interest. Second, seek out a fee-only fiduciary. Not someone who cold calls you, not someone your neighbor recommends because they're nice. A credentialed, fee-only planner who you pay directly for advice. The National Association of Personal Financial Advisors and the XY Planning Network are good places to start. Interview multiple planners. Ask how they're compensated. Ask if they're a fiduciary. Ask for references. Treat it like hiring someone for any important job, because it is. Third, educate yourself on the basics. You don't need to become a financial expert, but you need to understand fundamental concepts, what inflation is, what a withdrawal rate is, the difference between a fiduciary and a broker, what fees you should expect to pay, how different account types work. There are free resources everywhere, libraries, community centers, nonprofits that offer financial literacy programs for seniors. Take advantage of them. The more you know, the harder you are to take advantage of. Fourth, talk to your family. Tell them what's happening. Ask for help. You're not a burden. You're a person navigating something difficult, and the people who love you want to support you. Maybe your kids can help you find an advisor. Maybe they can review documents with you. Maybe they just need to know you're struggling so they stop asking you for money you can't afford to give. Whatever it is, don't do it alone. Isolation makes you vulnerable. And fifth, be very, very careful with large gifts or loans to family. It's okay to say no. It's okay to say, I love you, but I can't afford that right now. It's okay to prioritize your own security. Because if you give away too much and run out, You'll end up dependent on the very people you were trying to help, and that helps no one. Margaret's story is a tragedy, but it's also a lesson, a warning, a reminder that financial security is fragile, that not knowing can cost you everything, that trust without verification is dangerous, and that the stakes get higher as you get older because there's less time to recover from mistakes. If you're 68 and you lose half your money, you probably can't go back to work and rebuild it. You just have to live with the consequences, and those consequences can define the rest of your life. Let me tell you about where Margaret is now, 3 years after Tom died. She lives in a 650-square-foot apartment in a building that smells like old carpet and cleaning chemicals. Her furniture is the same furniture from the house: the couch where Tom used to fall asleep watching football, the dining table where they hosted Thanksgiving for 22 years. But now it's all crammed into a space half the size. The couch takes up most of the living room. The table is pushed against the wall because there's no room for chairs on all sides. Margaret eats her meals standing at the kitchen counter most days because it's easier than pulling out a chair. She doesn't see her grandchildren as much anymore. They used to come to the house. There was a yard, space to run around, a guest room where they could stay over. Now there's barely room for Margaret. When her daughter visits with the kids, they sit on the couch and Margaret pulls out the kitchen chairs. Everyone feels the smallness of it. The kids get restless. They want to go to the park, and Margaret says yes because she doesn't want them to remember her apartment as the sad place they had to sit still. After they leave, the apartment feels even smaller. The walls close in, and Margaret sits on Tom's couch and cries. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that come from somewhere so deep she doesn't even know what they're about anymore. The money, Tom, the house, the life that used to be hers, all of it. Her friends don't visit much either. Most of them still live in the old neighborhood, the neighborhood Margaret can't afford anymore. They invite her to things: lunch, book club, a weekend trip to the coast, and Margaret makes excuses, says she's busy, says she's not feeling well, because she can't afford lunch out, can't afford the gas to drive to book club, definitely can't afford a weekend trip, and she's too proud to say that, too embarrassed to admit that she went from a 4-bedroom house with equity to a rental apartment where she has to check her bank balance before buying toilet paper. So she just stops going, stops answering, and eventually they stop calling, not because they don't care, but because Margaret has made herself unreachable, and people get tired of reaching. The isolation is the worst part, worse than the money, worse than the apartment. Margaret spends most days alone. She watches TV. She goes to the library because it's free and air-conditioned, and she can sit there for hours without anyone asking her to buy anything. She takes walks around the apartment complex, same route every day, past the dumpsters and the parking lot and the sad little playground with the broken swing. She sees other old people, other women living alone. They nod at each other, but they don't talk, because what is there to say? Everyone here is in some version of the same situation, getting by, getting older, getting quieter. Margaret thinks about Tom every day, wonders what he would say if he could see where she ended up. Would he be angry that she lost the money? Disappointed? Or would he feel guilty for leaving her unprepared, for handling everything himself for 44 years and never teaching her how to do it? She doesn't know, and she'll never know. And that not knowing sits with her, a conversation she can't have, an apology she can't give or receive. She keeps his wedding ring in a dish by her bed. Sometimes she holds it, turns it over in her fingers, tries to remember what his hands look like, and she can't, not clearly. She remembers moments, but the details are fading, and that scares her more than the money ever did. At night, Margaret lies awake and does math in her head. She's 71 now.
Social Security is $1,900 a month after the cost of living increase. Her rent is $1,150. Utilities are about $180. Car insurance is $90. Health insurance supplemental is $200. That's $1,620 in fixed costs. Leaves her $280 for food, gas, medication copays, phone, everything else. It's not enough. Some months she makes it work. Some months she doesn't. When she doesn't, she uses the credit card, the one she swore she wouldn't use, the one that now has a balance of $6,400 at 22% interest. She pays the minimum, $140 a month, which means the balance barely moves. And every month, she uses it a little more. Because what choice does she have? The math doesn't work. It just doesn't. And she's too old to fix it, too tired to fight it. So she just keeps going, day by day, trying not to think too far ahead. Her daughter knows some of this, not all of it. Margaret lets her think things are tighter than they were, but manageable. She doesn't tell her about the credit card, doesn't tell her that some weeks she's eating rice and eggs for every meal because meat is too expensive. Doesn't tell her that she hasn't been to the dentist in 2 years because the copay is $80 and she can't spare it. Her daughter has her own problems. Her ex-husband is behind on child support. She's working 2 jobs. Margaret doesn't want to add to that weight, so she carries her own, quietly, the way she carried everything since Tom died. There are moments when Margaret feels angry, not sad, angry. At Tom for dying, at Richard for taking advantage of her, at herself for being so stupid, at a system that lets people like Richard exist, at the universe for making everything so hard when she's so tired. The anger comes in waves, usually when she's trying to fall asleep, or when she's at the grocery store and has to put something back because the total is higher than she thought, or when she sees an old couple walking together and realizes she'll never have that again. The anger sits in her chest, hot and useless, because there's no one to direct it at, no one to fight, just circumstances, just life. And you can't fight life. You can only survive it. But Margaret is surviving. That's the thing people don't always see. She's still here. Still
Getting up every morning, still making it work even when the math says she shouldn't be able to. She's learned to cook in ways she never had to before. Learned to stretch a dollar. Learned to live on less than she ever thought possible. She's tougher than she knew, more resilient. And there's a strange kind of pride in that. Not the life she wanted, but a life she's managing to live. And some days, that's enough. Some days, just getting through is victory enough. Margaret will never get back what she lost, but maybe by sharing her story, someone else won't have to lose theirs. Maybe someone reading this will recognize themselves in Margaret, will see the mistakes before they make them, will ask for help before it's too late, will protect what they have because they understand how quickly it can disappear. And if you're reading this and you're already in trouble, if you're already partway down the road Margaret walked, if you've already made some of the mistakes, it's not too late. Not completely. You can stop the bleeding. You can get out of the bad annuity, even if it costs you penalties. You can fire the advisor who's charging you 3% in fees. You can create a withdrawal plan starting today. You can reach out to your family and tell them the truth. You can find a non-profit credit counselor if debt is piling up. You can apply for benefits you might qualify for: SNAP, energy assistance, property tax relief programs for seniors, Medicare savings programs. There are resources. They're not enough to fix everything, but there's something, and something is better than nothing. The hardest part is admitting you need help, admitting you don't know, admitting you made mistakes. But that admission is also the first step towards protecting what you have left. Margaret waited too long, hid too much, tried to handle everything alone until there was almost nothing left to handle. Don't be Margaret. Be the person who asks for help while there's still time for help to matter. Be the person who says, "I don't understand this. Can you explain it differently?" Be the person who walks out of the advisor's office with unsigned paperwork and gets a second opinion. Be the person who tells their kids, "I'm struggling and I need support." It's not weakness, it's wisdom, it's survival. Because here's the truth. Nobody is coming to save you. There's no system designed to catch you when you fall. No safety net that guarantees you'll be okay. You have to save yourself. And the way you do that is by knowing what you don't know, by asking questions, by being skeptical of anyone who promises easy answers or guaranteed returns, by moving slowly and carefully instead of making fear-based decisions, by protecting your money like your life depends on it, because it does. At 65, at 70, at 75, your money is your freedom, your dignity, your ability to live independently. And once it's gone, it's gone. You can't earn it back. You can't undo the mistakes. You can only live with the consequences. That's Margaret's story. That's the warning. That's what happens when you don't know and you don't ask and you trust the wrong person at the worst possible time. Learn from it. Let it scare you just enough to be careful, just enough to slow down, just enough to get help before you need it desperately. Because the time to protect yourself is before the crisis, not after. And if you're reading this, you still have time. Use it.